Let's talk about Snow White. Over the last 10 years, Disney has released 17 live-action remakes, sequels, or spin-offs based on their beloved animated films. Yes, I'm as shocked by that number as you are. The most recent of these blatant cash grabs is Snow White, which is based on the iconic 1937 film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. From the moment it was first announced, the live-action film has been subjected to a wide array of controversies that I've discussed both on this channel and my side channel, and all of this backlash has led to the film's projected box office performance being much lower than initially anticipated. But is the movie as terrible as everyone was expecting it to be? Today I'm going to be discussing Disney's updated take on Snow White, specifically what I did and didn't like about it. Obviously, this is my opinion, and it's totally okay if you disagree, just don't be an asshole about it. Also, I only watched the movie a single time before making this review, and it's not like I could pause or rewind in theaters, so if I missed or misremembered something, please let me know. And even though I say it in every single movie review that I make, it still seems to fly over people's heads. So just to be crystal clear, there are going to be a lot of spoilers. You've been warned. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. The film begins with the opening of a storybook as an ode to old school Disney films, which I'm not gonna lie, I'm a sucker for. The narrator explains that the kind king and queen long for a child, and one night during a freak snowstorm, their wishes are granted, and they name their daughter Snow White in honor of the circumstances of her birth. It's also a not-so-subtle way of distancing the film from the character's usual descriptor of having lips red as blood, hair black as ebony, and skin white as snow, which was a huge sticking point when it came to the casting of the lead character. Considering the queen was already pregnant well before the storm, I personally think the reasoning for the name is a bit weak, although I have heard about people deciding to name their children Brittany on a whim because Oops, I Did It Again was playing in the car on the drive to the hospital. But if you ask me, they should have made Snow White a foundling, which also could have helped with the identity crisis she experiences later on in the movie. As Snow White grows up, her parents teach her how to be kind and good, leading by example by dancing with the townfolk and delivering them freshly baked apple pies. Snow White is nervous about living up to their expectations, but they tell her that if she continues wishing to become a better person, it'll happen. I did think it was funny that they made a big deal of her being such a good girl just because she decided to give a random peasant girl a flower crown. Like we couldn't give her a slightly more impressive moment, maybe saving a bird with a broken wing, which could have been a fun callback to the original film while also tying into her whole animal thing later on. It's a Disney movie, so of course Snow White's mother falls ill and dies, but she isn't motherless for long, and her father marries a mysterious woman who suddenly arrives at the castle. We're told that she's so beautiful that it's given her magical abilities, and I was absolutely flabbergasted by how quickly her powers were accepted. Considering magic doesn't seem to be commonplace in the kingdom, don't you think people would be a little bit concerned? Maybe not dunking her in water and calling her a witch, but surely they wouldn't act like it was a normal Tuesday. The movie spends a lot of time telling us that Snow White's father is the greatest king ever and is the embodiment of fairness and justice, but I found myself struggling to buy into his good guy act, considering barely any time passes before he gets remarried to the literal embodiment of evil and vanity. They don't even try to give us a simple explanation for why he moves on so quickly, like he thought Snow White needed a mother or that she bewitched him with her magic. It's just, oh, she was so hot he had to marry her. That shallowness just doesn't work if you're trying to depict him as this beacon of hope and light. Soon after they're married, the evil queen lies to the king and tells him that a neighboring country is planning to go to war against them, so he leaves to defend the kingdom, but not before giving Snow White a locket with the words fearless, fair, brave, and true inscribed on it. Snow White's stepmother seizes the throne and makes some drastic changes, forcing the villagers to become her soldiers and making Snow White a maid in the castle. There's a whole thing about the queen being obsessed with jewels, cause you know, she's vain, but I feel like the film didn't really make it super clear that the wealth was because she was overtaxing her subjects. All they did was make everyone wear less colorful clothing and have her play with some incredibly fake-looking gemstones. At least in Mirror Mirror, it's made abundantly clear that the people are struggling to get by, and that the queen is explicitly pocketing their money to fund her lavish lifestyle. Years pass and everyone forgets about the way the kingdom used to be, including Snow White. One day she meets a bandit, Jonathan, who has snuck into the castle to steal food for himself and his friends, and after being told of the state of the kingdom, Snow White decides to ask her stepmother to treat her subjects more kindly. The queen brushes her aside with a ridiculous analogy about roses and diamonds, which becomes a recurring motif in the film that never really pays off the way it should. I get that they're trying to depict Snow White as naive, but I think this scene is just outright ridiculous. Like, of course she isn't going to listen to you. She's literally making you scrub the floors. Jonathan eventually gets captured, and even though Snow White begs the queen for mercy, she tells her soldiers to take his clothes, tie him to the palace gates, and let him freeze to death. Snow White releases him and gives him a crust of bread, and when their hands touch, gasp, they share a moment. I'm not kidding, multiple people in the theater groaned because it was such a cliche. The magic mirror proclaims that Snow White is now the fairest of them all, and out of jealousy, the queen orders a huntsman to take Snow White to the apple orchards and cut out her heart, promising him anything he wants in return. There were several things that irked me about this sequence. For one, I felt as though we were missing a scene where the queen meets with Snow White and gives her fancy new clothes and lures her into a false sense of security by saying they're gonna bake pies for the townspeople. I feel like it would have been so much more impactful if Snow White had genuinely thought that she'd gotten through to her stepmother, only to realize, nope, she wants you dead. I also don't know why the huntsman was like, oh, I can't kill Snow White, she's too kind, when they've literally never met and all she does is give him an apple. I know they set up earlier that the people are starving, but since it's told to us rather than shown to us, the situation never seems that dire. And considering the huntsman is working for the queen, and there's a whole ass orchard with apples that are free for the taking, I don't think he'd be that impressed by some fruit. Although I will say that I like how it sets up him putting an apple in the jeweled box instead of the heart of a pig, which is a nice little update. Another thing that I don't love is how Snow White confronts him when he's about to stab her. The delivery is just a bit too obstinate, when one of the reasons he can't bring himself to kill her in the original film is literally because of her sweetness and innocence. The entire film is centered around the idea that Snow White needs to be more fearless in order to become a leader, but at no point does she ever actually seem that weak-willed. We're only 30 minutes into the movie, and she's already scolded the queen twice, freed a prisoner, and asked a man pointing a dagger at her throat why he's going to kill her. How much more brave could she possibly be? I feel like they really needed to let Snow White be a bit more of a weakling at the beginning, just so her growth was more apparent later on. To hide from the queen, Snow White flees into the woods, where she meets a group of helpful animals who lead her to a hidden cottage. She immediately walks in, heads right upstairs, and falls asleep, which I felt came across as a bit too presumptuous and entitled. In the original movie, Snow White initially thinks the dwarves are a group of orphans because of the state of the house. And as someone who also doesn't have a parent, she decides to make dinner and clean the house in the hopes that they'll let her stay with them. And I wish they'd kept some of that hesitance and worry because it was a part of the character's charm.
I know. We'll clean the house and surprise them. Then maybe they'll let me stay.
The dwarves eventually come home from working in the mines, where they discover Snow White. And although Grumpy initially wants her to leave, the rest of the group insists that she stay the night. The queen consults with her magic mirror and discovers that Snow White is still alive. And after she imprisons the huntsman, she sends the rest of her soldiers into the woods to find Snow White. The following day, Snow White spends some time with the dwarves, who despite living together for the last 274 years, bicker constantly, with poor Dopey often being the group's punching bag. Whenever I watch the original movie, I do get a bit tired of how Dopey is treated, so I was actually relieved to see him get a bit more love this time around, and I really like his and Snow White's dynamic. Now, before people start commenting on how Dopey didn't need to be fixed, obviously Walt Disney didn't have any ill intentions when creating him, but he's a clear product of his time, being a goofy, stooge-like character that isn't very popular in film anymore. After Snow White teaches Dopey how to whistle, allowing him to express himself verbally for the first time, she and the dwarves clean up the house. I know there's going to be a certain subset of people who are going to criticize that change as being too woke, because how dare a man be expected to clean up after himself, but I think this scene is just as fun as the original, and kids are definitely going to love it. Also, anyone who complains about the dwarves cleaning clearly didn't pay attention to the original movie, because there's an entire sequence where Snow White refuses to let them eat dinner until they wash themselves. Yes, even 87 years ago, she was sassy.
March straight outside and wash, or you'll not get a bite to eat.
Oh, you must be grumpy.
What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?
Believing that her father might still be alive, Snow White decides to search for the bandits, who claim to be fighting in the name of the king. She stumbles upon Jonathan, who negs her for a bit before helping her hide from the queen's soldiers. Although he insists that Snow White should run away and save herself, she comes back to help him, and he returns the favor by taking an arrow intended for her. She brings him to Doc, who despite not actually being a doctor, is able to help him, and the group spend the evening dancing and singing. Despite initially insisting that they're only friends, Snow White and Jonathan acknowledge their romantic feelings for each other, and almost kiss before they're interrupted. Jonathan promises Snow White he'll search for her father, and she gives him her locket as a token. But shortly after his journey begins, he's captured by the queen's soldiers and imprisoned alongside the huntsman. The queen transforms herself into an old hag and visits Snow White at the dwarf's cottage with a poisoned apple, and successfully tricks her into eating it by claiming that she and Jonathan are allies by showing her the locket. Snow White falls into the sleeping death, and upon discovering her body, the dwarves move her to a more magical resting place. With the help of the huntsman, Jonathan is able to escape from the dungeons, and he races to find Snow White, giving her a kiss that brings her back to life. And before anyone protests, there was literally a line in their love song that says, "Wake me with a kiss," so it's totally consensual now. Side note, I think they screwed up by letting the queen capture Jonathan. In the original movie, the evil queen scoffs at the antidote in part because she doesn't believe in love, but also because Snow White has been locked up in the castle for years. She had no idea she'd already fallen in love with the prince. Whereas in the remake, the queen is well aware that Snow White and Jonathan are an item. That's literally how she tricks Snow White into eating the apple in the first place. If she was fine with killing Jonathan when he was just a random thief, why would she simply imprison him when she now knows that he can do a lot more damage? Make it make sense. After she awakens, Snow White tries to convince the dwarves and Jonathan to help her overthrow the evil queen, and although they're initially unsure, they hop on board after Dopey suddenly talks, which was so egregiously out of character that I found myself shaking my head in the middle of the theater. Yes, they did set it up earlier that his mutism was a confidence issue, but the whistling was more than enough for me. When the villagers see Snow White, they quickly rally to her side, and she and the queen have a standoff in front of the palace. The evil queen attempts to goad Snow White into stabbing her, but she refuses, and when she's able to recall all of the names of the queen's soldiers, they join her cause as well. The evil queen attempts to kill Snow White herself, but her magic dagger crumbles into dust, and everyone begins celebrating. The queen then runs to the magic mirror, who tells her that Snow White will always be fairer than she is because she's kind and just. That doesn't really make sense now, does it? Because if the queen was never kind to begin with, why would the magic mirror have ever said her name in the first place? The queen smashes the mirror in anger, and Snow White watches as she's sucked into it, which is meant to imply that her powers came from the mirror itself, but it wasn't very well set up if you ask me. The film ends with the entire kingdom celebrating Snow White and Jonathan's marriage, and we can assume that they live happily ever after. The end. One of the biggest problems I had with the film was the pacing, which I think was negatively impacted by one too many characters and a bunch of plot points that served no purpose. For instance, I don't think they needed the captain of the guards to be an entirely different character. Just make it the huntsman. Instead of imprisoning him, the queen should have found a way to make him actually finish the job. Maybe by taking his family hostage? Plus, imagine when Snow White has her whole "I know who you are" moment at the very end. Instead of naming a bunch of random guards who we've never seen before, she calls the huntsman by his real name, something the evil queen has never bothered to learn. I mean, come on, it was right there. Jonathan's bandit friends were 7 other additions that I found totally superfluous, and part of me wonders if they were meant to be more important, but Disney changed their minds halfway through production. Quig is the only one who is remotely memorable. Like, I couldn't even tell you what the rest of their names were. So if they wanted someone for Jonathan to hang out with, it could still be him. But why not make him his brother instead of a random friend? It'd make more sense for Jonathan's whole "I'm selfish" shtick anyway. The bandits fighting in the name of the king thing honestly doesn't work in general, since Jonathan makes it very clear that he's stealing for himself. It's not a Robin Hood situation where people are wondering what his motives are. The filmmakers could have saved themselves a lot of time and hassle by making Jonathan an ordinary guy who has to steal out of necessity. Then when Snow White frees him, he goes into hiding of his own volition because obviously he's on the run from the law. Everyone still gets where they need to go, but it's a lot cleaner. A lot of people were concerned that Disney was going to get rid of the romantic relationship in the remake, so you can rest easy knowing that it's still there. But if you ask me, it still feels a bit underbaked. I'm not sure if it would work because of how messy the pacing already is, but I think that their first few meetings needed to breathe a bit. I would have still had them meet in the kitchens, with Jonathan not realizing that Snow White is the princess, and she could ask him to come back the following day so she could prepare more food for him to take to his family. This would be a small way of starting her evolution, instead of her immediately storming off to yell at the queen. Then when Jonathan comes by the following day, they could get to know each other a bit more. But then he'd get captured. And I think it'd be interesting if Snow White tried to speak up, but still didn't have the confidence. I feel like she needs to make this sort of mistake, since it gives him something to call her out on later. And it would make the moment where she frees him her most defiant act yet, giving it more weight. Snow White and Jonathan's dynamic is playful to the point of snark. And it actually reminds me a bit of Anna and Kristoff or Nick and Judy's relationship. But I feel like they were in desperate need of a vulnerable moment before suddenly deciding that they were in love. I can even think of the perfect place for it. After he's injured and Doc operates on him, why not have Snow White nurse him back to health? Like, I'm just picturing a moment where she's fallen asleep partially on his chest and he wakes up and is like, I can't breathe. They laugh and then they have a heart-to-heart. Although I appreciate that they found a way to keep the kiss in the story, I actually feel like it didn't make a lot of sense considering the setup of Snow White and Jonathan's relationship. I mean, they have an entire song about a hand meeting a hand, for Christ's sakes. Why not drop the kiss part of True Love's kiss and have him holding her hand be enough to break the spell? Then they could make out to their heart's content later. Plus, I think that would have created a nice contrast to the moment where the queen passes her the apple. From one hand death, the other life. You know what I mean? I really enjoyed Andrew Burnip's performance. He managed to be sarcastic without being outright condescending. But I do think that it's pretty obvious that he's a solid decade older than Rachel Zegler. I mean, he's literally closer to Gal Gadot's age in real life. Now, I'm not saying it looked outright creepy, but the whole time I was just like, that is a full-grown man. And I do think it's funny that Disney constantly tries to update its romantic storylines to be more appropriate for the modern age, but continues to cast their very young actresses with much older men. Because there are so many new characters who don't really do much, it takes time away from the people we know and love, most notably the dwarves. Although Grumpy, Doc, Dopey, and Happy still get a good amount of attention, Sleepy and Sneezy aren't really used apart from a few one-off gags. And for some reason, they really struggled to translate Bashful's mannerisms entirely. While Dopey and Doc's relationship with Snow White is solid in the remake, I felt as though her dynamic with Grumpy was lacking. In the original film, he has several moments where we can see that he has a bit of a soft spot for her. But in the new film, when he cries after her death, it kinda comes out of nowhere. But maybe that's because I generally found this depiction of Grumpy to be less old grandpa and more jaded employee. In the original film, the dwarves don't actually spend much time in the mines, but the remake spends a lot more time underground. While they still dig, there's a bigger emphasis on their mine carts. I'm pretty sure that this is a blatant marketing tactic on Disney's end to draw more attention to the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train roller coaster ride that they unveiled about a decade ago. Because at the end of the day, funneling more money into Disney's existing properties is exactly what these live-action remakes are for. I will admit that the dwarves take some getting used to, but the Uncanny Valley look at least serves a narrative purpose since they're actually magical creatures, not little people. I just wish they'd done a lot more with that magical subplot as a whole. Hear me out for a moment. Imagine that the evil queen is just your run-of-the-mill, self-centered stepmother with no powers, but then she discovers that the stones from the mines are actually magical. Hell, you could make the magic mirror a big-ass diamond. Instead of forcing all of the villagers to become soldiers for no reason, she could send them to the mines, but she doesn't realize that the only stones that are magical are the ones the dwarves have touched. But because they've been around for nearly 3 centuries, they know to steer clear of humans, which, side note, could also explain Grumpy's initial distrust of Snow White. Because it's the dwarves who are magical, not the stones, they could also have healing powers which Doc could use on Jonathan. They could also try the same thing with Snow White, only to realize that because the curse was made from the queen's magic, which is technically the dwarf's magic, they're not able to break the spell. Then voila, Jonathan can come in to save the day with true love. Although Rachel Zegler is one of the highlights of the film, and I have to applaud her for braving the endless shitstorm from alleged Disney fans, I don't know if I'm sold on the new direction of the character. As I've already mentioned, it feels like Snow White doesn't really have any growth over the course of the film. She tells the queen to be kinder to her subjects in the first 10 minutes, and repeats the sentiment in the final 10. Nothing's changed. One thing I really liked about the live-action Cinderella film is that Ella is a bit of a pushover at the beginning. Sure, she has a valid reason for it. Having courage and be kind were literally her mother's dying words, but there's a clear shift at the very end of the film where she's finally had enough and realizes that you also have to be kind to yourself. Snow White is given a similar motto, but she proves herself to be all of these things pretty quickly, to the extent that you're wondering why the hell she even allowed herself to become a maid in the first place. If Rachel Zegler is one of the best parts of the film, then Gal Gadot is one of the worst. Every single thing about her performance was terrible, and not even in a way that was fun. Her delivery was all over the place, her movements were cartoonish, and her singing was just painful. It's like she thought she was in a completely different movie, and every time she wiggled her fingers, I rolled my eyes. The only sequence where I thought she was any good was when she was disguised as the old hag, and it was so much better than anything else she was doing that I genuinely wondered if they'd subbed in another performer. Which sounds harsh, I know, but if you watch the film, you'll see what I'm talking about. I've mentioned it in my other videos discussing the live-action Snow White movie, but Gal Gadot just wouldn't have been my first choice for the evil queen. I've seen her in a handful of things over the years, and the only time it worked was the first Wonder Woman movie, which seemed to be a fluke, considering she could never pull off a similar performance in other installments. Compare that to other actresses who've played Disney villains, like Helena Bonham Carter, Cate Blanchett, Angelina Jolie, Emma Thompson, or Melissa McCarthy, who've all been nominated for, and even won, Academy Awards. I think Gal Gadot has a Teen Choice Award. I also don't like the weird crumbling effect that they used when she died. Maybe it's supposed to look like coal, but it just reminded me of Lord Voldemort. Most of the songs in Snow White were written specifically for the movie, and I'll be honest, they didn't really work for me, but I didn't expect them to, considering I'm not a fan of Pasek and Paul's work in general. Yes, that includes Dear Evan Hansen and The Greatest Showman. The two have also worked with Disney previously on Speechless for the live-action Aladdin, which I personally think is one of the worst sequences of the entire film, because not only is it a mess narratively, it just doesn't mesh well with the other songs. With that in mind, I am glad that the entire Snow White soundtrack was rewritten, because even if I'm not a fan of the direction myself, it does make it sound more cohesive. One thing I loved about the music from the Disney Renaissance is that the songs sounded totally different from film to film, but a lot of their newer releases start to blend together, which is certainly the case for Snow White. Good Things Grow could have been in Frozen, Waiting on a Wish sounds like something from Moana, and A Hand Meets a Hand could have been a deleted scene from Tangled. Now there are a few songs that I did enjoy, although I'm probably in the minority. I'm personally a sucker for a quirky, jazzy show tune that would have fit right in during the vaudeville era. It's why I love Wonderful in Wicked, Mr. Cellophane in Chicago, and Easy Street in Annie. For that reason alone, I found myself really liking Princess Problems. Now there is something about Andrew Burnip's delivery that makes him sound strangely like Kermit, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I love a Disney villain song. Always have, always will. So I was pretty excited when I heard they'd be adding one to the movie. All Is Fair is pretty good, but my god, you can really tell that Gal Gadot isn't a singer. And with Rachel Zegler in the same film, it's a coughing baby versus hydrogen bomb situation. There's just some very noticeable moments where Gadot is off pitch. And while the auto-tune corrections aren't as obvious as Emma Watson's in Beauty and the Beast, they're still noticeable, especially in the reprise. I know they wanted her to sound older in her hag form, but it just sounds way too overproduced. Now let's talk about the costumes. Can we talk about the costumes? I've been dying to talk about the costumes with you all day. Sandy Powell is one of my favorite costume designers of all time. And if you've seen our Best Dresses series, then you've probably noticed that she has the most inclusions of any designer by far. However, I couldn't help but feel like she wasn't at the top of her game for Snow White, something that I actually blame Disney for, as it's very likely that they meddled during the design process to ensure they could sell as many dolls and character meet and greets as possible. When Powell did the costumes for Cinderella, she was allowed to experiment with the characters' pre-existing outfits, which I think resulted in one of Disney's best-looking live-action remakes to date. A couple years back, there was a small scandal involving Disney and Jenny Beavan, the costume designer for Cruella. Beavan had designed several original looks for the film, which later served as the inspiration for a licensed fashion line that was released without Beavan being consulted or compensated. This caused quite a brouhaha. with Bevan allegedly even being let go from the Cruella sequel, and we can assume that Disney made a point of treading carefully with their costume designers from that point onward. This is perhaps best evidenced by Snow White, with the characters' outfits being near identical to their original designs, just a bit more easy to mass produce. I would have loved to have seen a version of Snow White's outfit that was less artificial, with no neon colors or layers of tulle. And while the Evil Queen's outfits are a dead ringer for her animated counterparts, I wanted something a bit more interesting. Also, one of my least favorite design choices are historical hoodies, and they just couldn't help but put Jonathan in one, but half the time it just looked like he was wearing a drug rug. I guess Mirror Mirror and Snow White and the Huntsman are still going to be battling it out for the best Snow White costumes. I've already seen some people say that this film is going to bankrupt Disney, but I think that's far from the case. First of all, Disney literally can't go bankrupt. They have way too many streams of income for a single film to do any real damage, which is also why it's so frustrating that they refuse to take any creative risks. Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, and Aladdin have all grossed over $1 billion, but I think it's ridiculous to expect the same turnout from any other film. Besides, it's not like box office returns are a surefire sign of a film's quality. And the last Disney live action that I remember people praising was Cruella, which only made $230 million on a $100 million budget. So if people aren't going around saying that Emma Stone bankrupted Disney, it isn't fair to blame Rachel Zegler for the same thing. Did Snow White need to get made? Absolutely not. But it also wasn't deserving of even half of the hubbub it caused. I'm tired of all of the live-action remakes in general, but I'll be the first to say that Snow White is by no means the worst Disney has to offer. That honor still goes to Pinocchio. What did you think of the live-action Snow White movie? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!